All right, another episode of Tom Kennedy Science, and I'm Dr. Tom Kennedy. I'm doing this series on cells, and of course, whenever we do series on cells, many places they focus on eukaryotic cells. I want to take a step back, and I'm going to do a two-parter on prokaryotes, and this is the first part. And I want us to come away with an understanding of the importance of prokaryotes in evolution. And I've done a lot of stuff on endosymbiosis before and great inventions of evolution, but we're just going to focus today on prokaryotes. And of course, my next episode will be on prokaryotic diversity and why that's important. But today, let's talk about the importance of prokaryotes for evolution. What's been their role? And I'll tell you what, it's important here. Now, a lot of times we think of prokaryotes as being primitive. I know, they're smaller. They're more structurally simple. Not always. There's some prokaryotic cells out there that are big enough for you to see with the naked eye. Look up Margarita namibiensis, for instance. It's like zero point 0.3 micrometers in diameter. It's enormous. Got a giant vacuole in it. Wait, did I just say it had a giant vacuole in it? It does. So yeah, prokaryotes can be large. They can have internal membranes. They can have cytoskeletons. Still not as complex as a eukaryotic cell. But despite all of this, they get this rap as being primitive. And I want to dispel that. They're not primitive. They have quick evolution times, right? And the reason why they can evolve so quickly is because of a rapid generation time. In a human, our generation might be 15 to 20 years. You hope not 15, but you could. But 20 to 30 years is the average generation time for a human. Bacteria, it's like 20 minutes, right? I mean, you have E. coli in your gut that are reproducing every 20 minutes. That means you have more generations of E. coli in your gut than there are generations separating humans from the last common ancestor of chimpanzees like 5 to 7 million years ago. Yeah, I know, that's a lot, isn't it? So those quick generation times allow for a lot of evolution. They just don't evolve to be complex cells or complex multicellular organisms like eukaryotes do. But despite that, they have evolved key evolutionary innovations that have basically changed the world. And the world you see today, we can thank prokaryotes for that. Let's take a closer look. First, there is just incredible diversity. In the metabolism of prokaryotes, both archaeans and bacteria. Now, importantly, they are autotrophs. They evolved all the autotrophic pathways. And of course, you probably are very familiar with photosynthesis, specifically an oxygenic photosynthesis. But there are other ways to do photosynthesis that involve hydrogen sulfide. And of course, another pathway called chemosynthesis. Okay, you may have heard of a lithoautotroph. These are rock-eating bacteria and archaeans. But the point here is that autotrophs can take carbon dioxide and add hydrogen to it, and you make organic molecules. Okay, so you need carbon dioxide, right? That's got to be in your environment. And you have to fix, like I said, hydrogen to that. And there is actually a pathway out there that doesn't require an input of energy. You can react hydrogen gas. Water mixes with the right type of rock, and that can release hydrogen gas and get a metal ion in there and react the two. And wow, you get an organic molecule, carbon and hydrogen. And you get some energy released from that too. That's an endergonic reaction. It's like getting paid to eat your lunch. They always said there's no such thing as free lunches, but that one pathway of adding hydrogen gas to carbon dioxide is basically a free lunch. And there are some bacteria out there that can do that in archaeans as well. But in general, the other pathways all require a source of energy. As you know, photosynthesis, they require sunlight to do that. Now, of course, photosynthesis. I mean, we get the importance of this, right? I mean, in today's world, it's all of our source of energy and carbon. I know the ultimate source of energy comes from sunlight, but it's plants that take that energy in sunlight and transform it and transfer it to make glucose molecules, to make organic carbon, right? So their source of electrons comes from water, and they take the hydrogens from water and the electrons, and they stick it onto carbon, and they make organic molecules out of it. And as a byproduct, you get oxygen, okay? Which we're starting to realize that's important, right? I mean, we need these things, oxygen and this carbon. But plants did not evolve photosynthesis. No, they did not. About 1 billion years ago or so, give or take a few 100 million years, I guess, some ancient eukaryotic cell engulfed, phagocytized some cyanobacteria, and that's where modern day chloroplast came from. So, plants did not evolve photosynthesis. Bacteria did some 3 billion years ago. And this was enormous, right? And the reason why is because prior to photosynthesis, those other autotrophic pathways either required energy, like from reduced rocks and electrons, or you had to live in an area where there was hydrogen gas. Now, of course, billions of years ago, there was a little bit more hydrogen gas than today. But the point is that life would have been really limited until photosynthesis, right? Because now with photosynthesis, you're making a lot more energy available to ecosystems. You're making a lot more carbon available to ecosystems. And that's important, right? You've got more energy, more resources. Life can really get going more and more now. And of course, as you know, oxygenic photosynthesis, when you take some carbon dioxide and some water, you get your carbohydrates. That's your carbon available to life, not to mention your energy, but it also releases oxygen to the atmosphere. And oxygen fundamentally changed this planet. And when I mean oxygen, I mean O2, which is free oxygen. And in fact, our Earth, 4 billion years ago was the Hadean Earth, entering the Archeans around that time. And basically, the atmosphere had methane, probably some ammonia, lots of carbon dioxide. It was hazy. The oceans were full of iron. And what happened is, with the advent of oxygenic photosynthesis, you had more oxygen in the atmosphere, and basically that oxidized all the methane, ammonia out of the atmosphere, oxidized iron out of the water. And today, as you can see, we have our nice blue planet. And a lot of that has to do with oxygen oxidizing everything. And of course, oxygen levels rose slowly, probably because it was oxidizing everything around it. And eventually you had to oxidize the iron out of the oceans. And then eventually oxygen levels got high enough where it began to affect life. And life had to deal with oxygen. Oxygen is the second most electronegative element in the universe. Oxygen oxidizes things. It can damage your membranes. It can damage your lipids. It can damage your proteins, and it can damage your DNA. So life had to evolve a way of dealing with the oxygen. Life evolved cellular respiration, and that is the ability to use oxygen. And what that did is it made life much, much more efficient at making ATP. Basically, the evolution of aerobic respiration made life way more efficient at making ATP. If you have one molecule of glucose and you're making 4 or 5, maybe less than 10 ATPs, now all of a sudden you're making 28 to 32 ATPs or even more on that one molecule of glucose. So oxygen really once again revolutionized the planet. This time oxygen energized life, and the adaptation was aerobic respiration. And it was, of course, bacteria, the ancestors to our mitochondria, that evolved that aerobic respiration. Animals didn't evolve aerobic respiration. Now, all of a sudden, from photosynthesis pumping out oxygen into the atmosphere, you have the evolution of aerobic respiration. Now, some aerobically respiring bacteria finds itself inside of an archaean, And from there, this called endosymbiosis, we now start seeing the first radical restructuring of cells in 2 billion years. Right. We're merging two prokaryotes, and then from that, we get the evolution of eukaryotic cells. And in fact, the origin of eukaryotes was a bit non-Darwinian. It began when a bacteria began living inside of another prokaryote, likely an archaean. Okay, so as you can see, the mitochondria started making lots of ATP inside the cells. As the cells grew larger and larger and larger, you just add more mitochondria, you make more ATP, and of course these cells become much larger. Then, as I said, about 1 billion years ago, you had a second round of endosymbiosis, or secondary endosymbiosis. And in this case, a eukaryotic cell did phagocytize. It did engulf a cyanobacteria that went on to evolve to become the chloroplast, okay? And this was important. This is once a free-living cyanobacterium, once again doing photosynthesis. And now that you've got this merger of these two prokaryotic cells that went on to evolve into eukaryotic cells, that sparked, of course, life being able to evolve into large complex organisms like plants, animals, and fungus. And if it weren't for bacteria that evolved photosynthesis in the first place, or bacteria that evolved aerobic respiration, the ability to use that oxygen, guess what? Eukaryotes wouldn't exist, plant and animal life wouldn't exist, and the world would be a much, much different place today. There would almost certainly be life, but it would be very confined to small parts of the earth where it would have a natural source of reduced rocks or hydrogen gas, or to some type of thermal vent. We would not see the world we see today if it weren't for those key evolutionary innovations of bacteria. Now, of course, they had many more other important innovations, but those are the two that I want to discuss today. So stay tuned for my next lecture, and it's going to be on prokaryotic diversity.